So firstly, thank you to everyone attending to this. So our Centre for Welsh Studies' third webinar event, which they've both gone fantastically up to now. So we've got a really great panel tonight, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy hearing their views, a wide range of views on devolution and as it has been delivering for Wales. Firstly, we're joined by Matt Kilcoyne. He's the Deputy Director of the Alan Smith Institute. Although he lives in London, he is a Welshman, and his research interests are trade, Brexit, and financial service regulation. Secondly, we're joined by Suzy Davies, who's been a Conservative member of the Welsh Parliament for South Wales West since 2011. She's a Shadow Minister for Education and the Welsh Language. And last but not least, we're joined by Tomos Davies, who's a Director at Fleshman Hillard, Deputy Chairman of the Welsh Conservatives, #1 list candidate for Mid and West Wales. Hopefully I didn't miss too much out there. So we will kick this off, firstly, straight to you, Matt. Has devolution been working for Wales, and is Wales moving forward after the past 20 years of devolution?
Well, there's a rather simple answer to that. No. Devolution in Wales has been a resolute failure in terms of its delivery for the people of Wales, in terms of making sure that Welsh issues are brought to the fore, and in its delivery of killing nationalism stone dead. It has failed to ensure that education standards have risen. It's failed to ensure that health standards have risen. It has meant that long-scale institutional memories have been lost across borders. It's meant, especially for the people of North East Wales, that a lot of our links to the northwest of England have been forgotten and forsaken in favour of recreation and duplication on an all-Wales basis. It's meant that healthcare, especially in North Wales, has fallen at the wayside of nationalist concerns. And it's meant that independence looks more and more likely rather than less and less likely. If I was to produce a scorecard for Welsh devolution, I'd say it's about approximately 1 or 2 out of 10. And the real shame here is that Welsh devolution could have delivered for Wales. It could have provided a platform to have ensured that there was a diversity of viewpoints, that Wales as a modern nation had a platform to push back against Westminster-focused policies, Whitehall over centralisation, but instead it duplicated that, and it created a nation within a nation, and it created an antagonistic nationalist setup that was always designed and will always be designed to have angry diatribe over delivering good governance for Welsh people.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting viewpoint. We seem to have lost Suzy. Hopefully she can rejoin in a second, but we'll move straight on to you, Thomas. I'll put the same question to you.
Well, thanks, Ed. Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to join the Centre for Welsh Studies this evening for what is a very topical debate, and I'm sure will be a lively discussion that follows. Ahead of this evening's webinar, and in order to inform our deliberations, I was thinking this afternoon about what sort of criteria can we apply or questions can we reflect on when assessing the success or otherwise of devolution. Now, in my mind, I think there are 3 key questions which devolution needs to address, and which I think can helpfully inform our discussions tonight. Namely, whether devolution, as Matt has already alluded to, has improved our public services and our economic outlook, that famous devolution dividend that was promised to us by the architects of devolution in the 1990s. Second, whether devolution has actually improved the quality of political representation and engagement here in Wales since 1998. And perhaps thirdly, and finally, and perhaps most crucially of all, whether devolution actually has strengthened the United Kingdom and made our constitutional settlement that more resilient and more enduring. And much like Matt, I'm afraid, across all 3 measures and in response to all 3 questions, I think devolution at best has scored a D+ over the past 20 years or so. And allow me to elaborate, if I may, a bit more on my thinking in that regard. On that first measure, as I said, the architects of devolution very much sold to the Welsh electorate, a very sceptical electorate in 1997, that devolution would somehow create a more representative and more accountable government, with decision-making, of course, being closer to the people of Wales. But sadly, I think one of the cruel ironies of devolution is that Wales, and indeed for that matter, Scotland, have become the most centralised nations within the UK, with powers, certainly in Wales, increasingly being hoarded in Cardiff Bay. I know that to be the case too in Holyrood, in Edinburgh, rather than those powers, as ought to be the case, being devolved downwards and outwards to our local communities and to our local authorities. And the once derided quangos, again, of the 1980s and 1990s, have mainly been replaced, it seems, by a new Welsh political class, a whole new generation, it seems, of commissioners, advisory boards, stuffed to the rafters with Labour Party grandees. And related to that, I think, it's important to note that in the absence of a strong Indigenous Welsh media too, I think there's been far too little scrutiny and far too little accountability of decision-making in Wales over the last few decades. And as a result of that, that in turn, I think, has stifled political debate in Wales. And as a result, we've perpetuated much of the groupthink that seemingly prevails in Cardiff Bay. Now, on the second measure, whether devolution has improved our public services and improved our economic outlook, again, I'm afraid that devolution dividend that was promised to us simply hasn't materialised. Matt's already alluded to the failures within the education system. The failures within the Welsh NHS are well documented. After all, the only area of the UK where the NHS has been starved of resources and the NHS budget has been cut. But most sobering of all, I think, are those crucial economic indicators. After 20 years of devolution, we are still disproportionately reliant on the public sector in Wales. We've yet to attract anywhere near the sort of inward investment into Wales that the WDA famously attracted in the 80s and the 90s. And sadly, despite this experiment over the last 2 decades or so, we consistently lag behind the rest of the UK, both in terms of productivity, economic outlook, real wages, as well as disposable household income. Now, of course, much of that policy legacy that I've outlined, and Matt has already alluded to as well, lays squarely at the feet of the Welsh Labour government. But it would be remiss of me, and remiss of us all as a panel, not to reference or to at least acknowledge the contribution that the constitutional settlement has made towards that challenge. Which brings me to this final question, and my final set of opening remarks, if I may. And that is whether devolution has strengthened the United Kingdom. You may recall it was George Robertson, I believe, Golly, who I think he was the Labour Shadow Scottish Secretary at the time, who subsequently became NATO Secretary General, who bullishly in the 1990s, or perhaps naively as it has since transpired, proclaimed that devolution would kill nationalism stone dead. And yet here we are this evening discussing at the start of a new year how best to protect the union, scrambling to preserve this political union of ours from a position of real political weakness, if I might say so. I mean, if we look at the findings of that Sunday Times poll from the weekend, which was a stark reminder of the scale of the challenge which unionists face over the coming weeks, which suggested that close to a quarter of the Welsh electorate, who would have believed it, a quarter of the Welsh electorate would back Welsh independence, that Scots would back in their droves Scottish independence tomorrow. And crucially, fewer and fewer people in Wales and indeed across the UK now seemingly relate to a British identity. I think those numbers from the weekend made for some pretty sobering reading and was a stark reminder, I think, of the scale of the challenge ahead of us, and a scale, I think, and a reminder, if I may say so, of the failure of successive governments. There's no other way of putting it. The failure of successive governments, both with Labour and indeed Conservative, of addressing and resolving the constitutional question. I think it's fair to say that most governments, including this present government, have rather shrugged their shoulders at devolution. The approach seems to be to devolve further powers, to try and buy off the nationalist threat with yet another Wales bill, as the case may be, and to simply devolve and to forget, in some belief that this will just simply this issue will go away and will resolve itself in the fullness of time. But that sort of approach to devolution, that sort of approach to the Constitution, has and will have profound consequences for the Union. I think the challenge ahead of us in the months ahead is to remind voters of the immense contribution of the Union, and to remind them of the practical difference that the Union makes to our everyday lives. I'm the first to recognise that the UK government, save for some of the macroeconomic policy levers that it still has, doesn't actually have a great deal of political sway or influence on those key bread and butter issues in Scotland and Wales. So the challenge is to inject the UK government into political discourse and into political debate in Wales. And in that regard, I think the COVID pandemic certainly has helped to an extent in so far as shining a spotlight, I think, on the fragility of the Welsh economy and reminding those who seemingly advocate for further powers or indeed for Welsh independence that actually Wales very much relies on and benefits, derives huge benefits from the economic might of the UK government, of the UK Treasury in particular. But I think there is a battle on our hands, I think, to win this debate. I think I think further commissions, further committees, further devolution of power is simply for the birds. And I think unionists need to loudly and proudly proclaim, as I think they haven't done enough in recent years, the immense benefits that we derive from the union, but as well as that, crucially, to reaffirm that sense of belonging, that sense of community, as well as I say, those immense political and economic benefits that we all four home nations derive from this glorious political union of ours.
Thank you. And Suzy just managed to get reconnected in time. So Suzy, I'll put the question to you. These just Matt and Thomas have both done their introductory opening questions. Has 20 years on now, over 20 years on, oh, she seems to have gone again, unfortunately. So we'll try and, if she comes back, maybe she doesn't, I don't know if she likes the question or not, but if she comes back, we'll try and answer it. But we'll follow on.
In which case, Ed, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to jump back on to what Tomos was saying.
Sure, go ahead.
When we say devolve and forget, I need everyone to remember that what they're saying there, and which is true, of course, that is exactly what has happened. Many people, whether Labour or Conservative, devolved and forgot. And what they're doing there is forgetting you. They have forgotten you. That's what it means. That they have handed these powers over your life to somebody else and then forgotten about you, whether they are Conservative or Labour. And although, Thomas, you did a very good speech, and I agree with a lot of it, you did one of the things that is a pet peeve of mine, which is the Four Nations approach, the UK government, Team GB, the lack of the term British. We are British. It is what we are as a people. If we are not British, if we cannot say it out loud, then how on earth can we expect the next generation to do so as well? How on earth can we expect that feeling of belonging to actually mean anything? I don't know a single person who feels stirred in the blood to defend the UK government. I do know people who do sign up readily for Queen and Country, for Britain, who will sing at the last night of the proms, who will wrap themselves in the Union flag having won a race, or who even, and as we all know, Wales is singing the song of the national anthem, whether that is Mein Henlad Nadai or God Save the Queen. I do not know a single person who goes the Four Nations approach and thinks that is a way in which to inspire people. It seems defeatist, and it's that thing that I'm desperate to turn the tide on. Well,
apologies, Matt, if I brought up one of your pet peeves. Let me correct the record and align myself firmly with what you've just said. I think it's incumbent upon not only the Conservative Party but also every good unionist to loudly and proudly proclaim that sense of Britishness. And in that regard, I certainly think, in light of some of the significant political developments of recent months, least of all the development of a shared prosperity fund, for example, I think that is a tangible way of fostering and developing that collective sense of Britishness, that collective sense of belonging. Though I do think it will take a heck of a lot more than slapping, of course, a few Union Jacks and some flags on future infrastructure projects to fully win that battle. But I certainly think it's a step in the right direction, because I think for far too long now, Conservatives in particular have been reluctant to engage in debates around nationhood, and certainly reluctant to engage in a conversation around where powers ought to lie. We, as a Conservative and Unionist party, should, as I said, should loudly and proudly proclaim confidence in our identity as Welsh patriots, as fiercely proud Welsh Conservatives, but on the other hand as well, loudly and proudly proclaim a sense of Britishness as well. And I think on that page we're fully aligned, I hope.
Right, I'll start with some questions. We've got a few answers, and then after this, I'll ask one of these ones we've had emailed in, and I'll start on the ones that are flooding in now. But the first one we've got emailed in, I'll pick one here. Do you believe that devolutionists funded and legitimised the call for independence? I'll start with you, Matt.
It's certainly. Suzy's back.
Suzy. Suzy, do you want to? We'll get you to do your opening question. Hopefully, you stay on this time for me to read it out. Just to ask these 20 years of devolution, is Wales moving forward? So, do you think devolution has been a success in Wales, and in the past 20 plus years it's been in action?
Oh, we've lost her again.
I've lost her again. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think we may have lost Suzy again. Yeah. Yes. So
perhaps you should add a lack of reliable broadband connectivity.
Connectivity
to the catalogue of Labour failures over the last 20 years. I think we can confidently do that, can't we?
So yeah, I will go
in terms of funding. Shall we go to the funding? Has it funded and legitimised? Well, it certainly funded it, because even if you just do short money, it has allowed a professionalisation, legitimisation of a nationalist force at Cardiff Bay to build up an office. In fact, actually, bizarrely, is what annoyed what Plaid Cymru did. Is very annoyed. They're very annoyed by the sort of and scared by the risk of either abolish or reform UK creeping into Cardiff Bay and being able to use money, set up an office, send out press releases every day, get the voice. They're very scared of that exact same pattern that they use to build up and legitimise themselves on a day-to-day basis in the media in Wales, but from the opposite side, especially considering Cardiff itself, maybe not the fashionable bits, maybe not the people who are invited to the parties down at the Senedd or the Customs House or whatever, but Splot, Cateys, so on, far more likely to share views with the Forum UK side or from the Abolish, the Welsh Assembly, especially up in the valleys, much more likely to than support the views of Plaid Cymru up in Dyfan Meirionnydd or Gwynedd or so on. And so that's, I think they are scared by that, but I think also it has very much legitimised them, given them a base of operations and given them a platform with which, and more importantly, staff and time with which to contrive grievances, which they have used very effectively against, because the entire setup of a nationalist-based devolution settlement, whether it's in Wales or Scotland, has been about creating alternative states within the UK, which are entirely focused on having antagonistic arguments with Westminster, usually on money, because they got given the responsibility of delivering services, but absolutely no accountability on bringing cash in. And so they've just been on spend, then complaining that there isn't enough spend, and then demanding that somebody else borrows on their behalf, that they don't take any liabilities. So yeah, it's given them cash, it's given them ability, it's given them moaning powers, but it's given them no actual responsibility or accountability from to voters.
Thomas, I put the same question to you. Do you believe that devolution has funded and legitimised the calls for independence?
Well, it's certainly given a platform to the nationalist cause. That's certainly the case in Scotland, where, as I said in my opening remarks, we needn't look any further than that Sunday Times poll, which showed a majority of Scots overwhelmingly, regrettably, supporting calls for a Scottish referendum, and indeed a vote in favour of leaving the Union. But I wanted to pick up, if I may, on the point that Matt was making in relation to financial accountability. I think he's bang on the money, as he often, as he and the Adam Smith Institute often are on these issues. And I certainly think we have grown accustomed to the politics of grievance here in Wales, where the playbook for successive devolved governments is to wag their finger at Westminster, to go with their begging bowl, to play the politics of grievance, to seek more money, more powers, whatever the case may be. And when that doesn't bear fruit, to accuse the British government of somehow being an English government which has the interest of England at heart and is somehow unrepresentative and unresponsive to the unique political and cultural needs of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I certainly hoped, and indeed it was my expectation with the passage of the last Wales Bill, which I had a small part to play as a then Wales Office Special Advisor, that actually with the passage of that Wales Bill, that we may just finally draw a line in the sand and bring an end to these perennial debates about powers, about money. And it was certainly the intention of the architects of that bill that in devolving partial powers with regards to income tax, that we might finally bring a bit of accountability to bear to the way that the Welsh government spent taxpayer money in Wales, and crucially to shift the debate, as I say, from this constitutional debate, from fixating on the architecture of devolution to actually those bread and butter issues that really matter to people, and how we might improve our public services, reform those public services, drive economic prosperity, and crucially have a mature and thoughtful debate on how best to raise money and to spend money. Perhaps that was wishful thinking on my part, and indeed the last government. But I certainly hope that with the devolution of those income tax powers, that we might finally, one day, just one day, move the debate on in Wales and actually interrogate a bit further how Welsh government raises and spends its money in a way that perhaps we haven't done enough of over the past 20 years or so.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Suzy's problems with the internet a bit too much, so we always have to carry on without her, and maybe she can join us a bit later on, maybe not. But yeah, I think we'll have a question now from the panel. So this might be a bit too hard for you to go off what you said, but Nick Evans asks, I think we can all outline the failures of devolved governments since 1999, but what positives, if any, do you think that the panel think that's been achieved?
Ollie, well, first of all, it's good to see you, Nick. Congratulations as well on your selection in South East Wales. I think as a policy incubator, as a test bed for policy innovation, devolution has had some success. We've been able to, in certain policy areas, whether for better or for worse, I might add, we've been able to cut our own course, we've been able to innovate, we've been able to experiment with different policy approaches. And where those policies have arguably been successful, they've soon been picked up by successive UK governments and replicated in England. Though I would caveat that by saying that, by actually adding that actually those policy initiatives which have been innovated in Wales and subsequently adopted in England, I myself have very little traction for. I think of the organ donation reforms, for example, as being one area in which Wales has arguably charted its own path, and England has subsequently followed suit for better or for worse. But the real challenge, I think, in Wales is that we probably haven't done nearly enough of that policy thinking and policy innovation, because as I said in my opening remarks, there is this groupthink that prevails in Cardiff Bay. If you look at the political class in Wales, if you look at the political establishment, if you look at our think tanks, present company excluded, of course, Edward, most of the political discourse and intellectual conversations in and around Cardiff Bay gravitates towards a nationalist bent or a left-leaning perspective. We've had very little debate in Wales about how we can really grapple with some of the major structural and economic challenges that we need to get to grip with in Wales. And that's why I was so pleased to have the opportunity a few months ago, Ed, to pen that piece for the Centre for Welsh Studies, calling for a radical new economic model for Wales, with a commitment to cut taxes, to make Wales the most desirable place to move, to raise a family, to start a business by abolishing business rates for all those with a rateable value of up to £15,000, to use these income tax powers to knock a penny off income tax in Wales, which I think would be the right signal to those hardworking families in Wales who are really struggling to balance the books throughout this pandemic. It's that sort of bold, innovative economic blueprint that we require. But as I say, I think there's been far too little of that radical thinking in response to Nick's question.
Put the same question to you, Matt. Do you think there's been anything good that's come out, any good parts of devolution in the past 20 odd years? You're on mute, by the way.
I did a Robert Peston. I'm so sorry about that. I suppose it's what you depend good on. If you are a nationalist who thinks on Wales just as a single unitary state that wants to separate from the UK, if you think that the Welsh nation has been traduced and oppressed and suppressed for centuries, and that this is finally a chance to get one over on the guys next door, then devolution has been, in some respects, a success. I think it has been very successful in making Wales a less open, a less welcoming place. I certainly don't think that my parents, who are both from England, who've lived in the northeast of Wales for a quarter of a century and more, actually now 3 decades, would move there now. I don't think that it's a place that English people feel welcome in. I don't think it's a place that anywhere that other people from around the world see as a beacon for which is very different from Wales historically, of course. The southeast of Wales, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, had people from across Europe and across the world come and build its industry, built it right up to being one of the world's greatest and richest places. I think that in the recent decades, it has slid back to parochialism. It has slid back to an inward-looking and actually exclusionary place. I think it has been very successful in making people's identities, such as mine, people who live across the border, people who live lives that do not fit a mold of being Welsh per se, but of being British across multiple identities, being maybe small W Welsh rather than big W Welsh. It has meant that we feel pretty like deflated on a daily basis, that we are not valued, that we are second-class citizens, that people who wake up in the morning and who want to choose the language of their kids, and actually they find out that their local village only offers Welsh now because that is a policy, having spent decades agreeing with their neighbours that Welsh should be an option at the school, that you shouldn't be forced to send your kid to school just in English, but now have to send them in Welsh because that's the nationalist policy that has come in. They feel pretty malign. I think that the Welsh devolution has been very successful for a small group of people who have lauded it over others and the majority in this country. And that has been a miserable outcome for the rest of us.
Thank you. Certainly two very similar views on this. Unfortunately, that of Suzy, I'm sure would have been able to give a different opposing view on this. But we'll move on to another question now, which is a very interesting one, a very good point that brings in the whole union into play. And it's from James Heal. He says, how much of a factor is Scotland in deciding how diva-skeptic Welsh unionists should be? Surely any rolling back of the Senedd would be used by the SNP as a sign that the Tories cannot be trusted on devolution and thus endanger the union elsewhere?
I think this is a really good point. James raises a really, really good point. That tactically, bizarrely, of course, it's exactly how devolution in Wales started. Right, the devolution referendum in 1997 was timed to be just after the Scottish devolution referendum, so that the Welsh electorate knew which way to vote. And even then, it only just voted for devolution, but it was in a very tight vote. But it was designed so that Welsh people would see that Scotland wanted it, and therefore that they should also want it. And devolution, look, if the SNP would obviously make hay with any rollback of powers, any seen to be control or desire to end or abolish the Senate, but it's very different, I think, from having an election or changing party policy without consulting the electorate. The electorate are aware of what a decision is that's being made. That's nothing to be feared. The SNP has consistently rejected the devolution settlement. The SNP's entire raison d'etre is about rejecting the devolution settlement. That's the whole point of independence. That's what Plaid Cymru want as well. It's always about rejecting it. In fact, every single time we've had a referendum on powers anywhere in the UK, that's a bit about rejecting the devolution settlement. There's naturally a level of ebb and flow as to where power should sit, who they should sit with, and that's a genuine grown-up conversation that I think electorates are very clever to have. Of course, the SNP will spin anything. They'd spin the wind blowing down the street as a reason for independence or a reason why we must leave the UK, but you shouldn't take that as good enough. Like, if the public walk into an election with their eyes open, wide aware of what's happening, and that the parties in different parts of the UK have different responses because, as we all know, they're unique, that would be reasonable. And in fact, it's quite unreasonable for a party like the SNP that wants Scotland to be unique and independent to not recognise that there are other parts of the UK with unique and independent situations, of which situations therefore depend upon them and their voters. But yeah, I think it would be, I think obviously they would make hay with it, but they make hay with anything.
And Tomos, I put the same question to you. How much of a factor is Scotland in deciding how devolution Welsh unionists should be? Surely any rolling back of the Senate would mean be used by the SNP as a sign that the Tories cannot be trusted on devolution and thus endanger the union elsewhere.
Well, Scotland has always been a key influence and a key factor on informing the UK government's approach to devolution. I remember full well when I was in the Wales office, Number 10 paid little regard, I think, to what was really happening in Wales. You know, as part of its efforts on the union, Scotland, understandably and rightly so, I think, at the time, dominated the government's posturing in relation to the constitution. I think the UK government has finally woken up to the real threat now in Wales of Wales charting its own political course and emulating the example of the Scots. And it's encouraging, I think, to, as I said in my opening remarks, to see the UK government understand the need to put appropriate machinery of government in place to reassert UK government authority and UK government legitimacy in Wales. As I said, I think the Shared Prosperity Fund, which of course has antagonised the nationalist element both in Scotland and Wales, but in my mind is absolutely the right approach in terms of bypassing the devolved administrations and using the collective muscle of UK government to level up the nations and regions. And I think that sort of muscular unionism, that sort of policy intervention and political machinery is precisely the sort of approach that we need from the UK government. And I think Welsh unionists are finally waking up to the independence threat. It can no longer be treated as if it was some sort of fringe movement. You know, that Sunday Times poll at the weekend illustrated that quite clearly. And I think it's refreshing to see the UK government at long last paying due regard to both Wales as well as Scotland in its approach to devolution and to constitutional reform.
Well, very great good answers there, because yeah, obviously whenever we talk about Wales, and we have to take into account there's Scotland as well, like you say, which is much more teetering close to the edge of independence. So it's a very poignant question by James. We've got another one that got us emailed in this past week, and it's quite an interesting one because we've talked about where devolution's gone so far, what devolution has meant for Wales up to now, but this one sort of focuses on the future, and it says, where do you see the future of Welsh devolution? So we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I've made my views quite clear. I think the next Conservative manifesto, and we wait with bated breath for its publication in the coming weeks. It understandably has been delayed by a minor hiccup, as you may recall, following last week's political events in Cardiff Bay. But it is my hope, and indeed my aspiration, that as part of that policy package that Andrew and the team will be putting forward, there will be a commitment to, in the next Assembly term, or the Senate, I should say, to park the constitutional question. There can be no longer further debates, further commissions, committees, or conventions. There has to be in the next Assembly term, in my mind, a relentless focus now on growing the Welsh economy from the wreckage caused by COVID, a relentless focus on reforming our public services. And I think that same political establishment, that same political class in 2016, which so spectacularly mistook the mood of the electorate with regards to Brexit, are in danger of committing the same mistake again with further calls for further powers, further devolution, further elected members, for crying out loud. There is little public appetite for that direction of travel, and I very much hope that Andrew and the team will have the courage and the confidence to as part of that manifesto, to lay out a platform which will slam the brakes on any further devolution of power, and, as I said, loudly and proudly proclaim a strong Wales within an even stronger United Kingdom.
Well, very interesting to see, like you said, after last week's hiccup, to see where the new manifesto, new team take for the Welsh Conservatives. It'd be interesting to see what they make on this interesting questions. But I put this question to you, Matt. Where do you see the future of Welsh devolution?
Well, I think fortunately we look forward to Tomos being in the Assembly. Actually, you're quite likely to make it into the Assembly.
I'm not so sure about that. I'm pretty confident that my good friend James Evans will vanquish the electoral threat of the Liberal Democrats in Brecon and Radnorshire. But I appreciate the sentiment all the same, Matt.
Well, we'll keep an eye out. We'll keep an eye out, because it would be a good addition, I think, frankly. But I think what would be nice to see would be Andrew R.T. Davies, obviously back at the helm of the Welsh Conservative. Is a very positive move. But it would be nice to see a commitment to ensuring that cross-border areas, whether the North East, whether Powys, whether it's Monmouthshire and Newport, have the tools, the ability, and also the political emphasis, to work cross-border where it works, where it's right to do so. I think we watched some of the sort of farce earlier last year, when they shut testing sites up in North Wales to consolidate down into a single testing site down in Cardiff, and people were asked to drive for 4 hours in some cases down to Cardiff to get a test for COVID, which just showed up some of the absurdity of this one Wales approach to everything, when we know that there's a big population centre in Wrexham, just beyond Wrexham, in Chester, Liverpool, Manchester, and if you're in Powys, that Birmingham's not that far away. Sometimes geography does actually have to start to play into consideration again, rather than just borders put in place by princelings long gone. This should be about devolution should be about delivering good governance for Wales. It should be about having a voice that stands up, but making sure that the various parts of the UK are joining up with the right parts of Wales. It makes no sense for me to see two ferries, one in Haverfordwest and the other up in Holyhead, out into getting next to no attention, whilst in terms of their trade with Dublin. Well, Dover gets all the attention, Felixstowe gets all the attention down in the southeast. What's the point of the Welsh Government if not to give that? What's the point of them having links to media if not to highlight the issues that are coming up, whether it's about Brexit or not. And even making the case to have joined up thinking with maybe Andy Burnham, the city mayor's, not Joe Anderson anymore in Liverpool, I don't know what's happened with that one, but in terms of the city mayors up in Liverpool and Manchester, that should be a corridor of prosperity all the way to Dublin, including all the way out into Holyhead. Instead, they're some of the poorest communities in the whole of the UK, because they're not just devolved and forgotten from Westminster, it's devolved to Cardiff, and then North is forgotten from Cardiff. So it's sort of like, we need to have a commitment again that every policy will be looked at, that every policy area will be looked at, and a commitment to joining up Wales with the rest of the British Isles, not just the United Kingdom, but the rest of the British Isles, where possible, and making sure that the right people are empowered, the funding is there for that. So I would say a total rethink of how we can link our great country up with the rest of the Isles should be at the heart of the policy for the Welsh Conservatives at the next election.
Well, following on from this, there's a good question from Hugh Davies, actually sort of following on to that point. He says, does the panel believe that national devolution should be reversed and replaced with stronger local authorities and elected mayors? You mentioned Andy Burnham, formerly Joe Anderson, obviously whoever takes over from him now. But yeah, do you think that could be a way forward, as Hugh asked? Do you think that could be a potential way forward for Wales instead of just reverting back straight to a Westminster system, or keeping what the settlement we have now? Do you think there's a third way settlement to be had?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there is. I would suggest, and I've suggested, that devolution should effectively allow, there should be a series of powers which do not sit at Westminster where possible, whether that's over planning policy, whether that's over environmental, whether that's over schooling, and that if you, as a local authority, or as a group of local authorities, or as a city region, or even in some cases a cross-border region, come together and demand those powers, whether that's at whether they currently sit at Westminster, or whether they currently sit at Cardiff Bay or Holyrood or Stormont, and you say we want these together, they should be devolved immediately down to you. And the only role for Holyrood or for Cardiff Bay in that situation should be as a blocking force to say no, no, no. But they should be forced to say no. And Westminster should be forced to say no to English regions that say that as well. Because what has to happen is, instead of imposing powers down or saying, do you want more powers? They should come up with plans for what they're going to do with the powers in the first place, so that they then deliver immediately on those plans and are accountable for them. Instead, what we ended up with was, here's some blanket powers, they're for you now, and then then we've been surprised when, having not had any institutions for 800 years, so they've not been able to deliver with the powers that they've been given. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. That was obvious to everyone who knows how institutions work. You ended up with institutional incapability rather than institutional capability, which is the whole point of conservatism. So we should go back to the point of saying, okay, fine, if you can come up with a way in which you're going to want new powers, then you can start to demand those powers down to you at a local level and start to have a difference. And you end up with, you end up with different powers in different places. But that wasn't a concern of devolutionists. It shouldn't be a concern of conservatives either. We should be about delivering the powers that people want in the places people want them.
Yeah, a very interesting viewpoint. Like you said, I don't think the current settlement is going to stay around for too much longer. If people have their way, I think we'll see being pulled in different directions. So I put this question to you as well, Thomas. Do you believe that national devolution should be reversed and replaced with local authorities elected or a different third way that we hadn't been discussed?
A great question, and you'd expect no less from Hugh Davies. I certainly think the model of devolution that we have in England is particularly attractive. If you look at the success of the Metro mayors, for example, Steve Rotherham in the Liverpool City region, Andy Burnham, for example, these figureheads have a huge personal mandate. And because of their elected mandate, they have this immense convening power and authority as well, to go out there to attract inward investment, to fly the flag for their respective regions, to go into battle with Treasury, as Burnham so successfully did during the COVID pandemic. In a way, perhaps, a devolved legislature cannot. Having said that, I think the very thought of unpicking the devolution settlement and having another decade of debate around where powers should lie fills me with absolute horror. I would certainly, however, wish to encourage and to see a future Welsh government unleash some of the powers that have been hoarded in Cardiff Bay, and to devolve them downwards and outwards into the local communities. And certainly with the delivery of the Mid Wales Growth Deal, for example, similar growth deals for North Wales and the Cardiff City region respectively, I think there needs to be some thought given now to developing some accompanying governance and political representation in and around those city deals. I think city deals are a wonderful initiative by the UK government and can really unlock the economic potential of these left behind regions in Wales. But I think if we're to take that agenda a step further and to really unleash the potential, particularly the North Wales and the Mid Wales region, I think we need the accompanying political leadership and the political authority and gravitas, which I think comes from a directly elected mayor, as we've seen across the board. And I think that's certainly an agenda which I would have some sympathy with, and I would advocate and encourage my colleagues to take a look at if in government post May.
Well, following on from this, we've got a question in the chat. I can't see who asked it. All I can see is Charles. And so a question from Charles is, he goes, is this not a reason to move to a federalist structure then? Is that not the way forward like we see in other countries like Germany, where although you have federal states, it's very hard for them to actually leave Germany as a nation. So would you see that as a potential way forward? Or do you think the devolution stay as it is, like you say, because it feels with another 10 years of this would be dreadful for all involved?
Another great question from Charles Law and Brecon Ragnarshire, and great to see you on the webinar, Charles. Superficially, federalism or a quasi-federal system has its merits, and I can see the attraction. The biggest challenge, of course, with a quasi-federal system in the UK is that you would have an English Parliament, I assume, which, given the sheer scale and size and political and economic might of England, would in turn rival the political authority and sovereignty of the UK Parliament. So I just don't think a federal settlement is realistic or attainable. I mean, the federalist models that we often reference, Canada, for example, an area of the world I know well, having lived there for a few years, the federal system works there because you've got these counterweights. You have a strong Quebecois government on the one hand, but also you've got strong provincial governments in the west. You've got Ontario as well, and together they kind of collectively balance one another out. If we were to go down a federalist route here in the UK, my fear is that England would come to dominate that federal system, and that English Parliament, which we would have to have conceivably in a federal settlement, would rival and indeed undermine the sovereignty of the British Parliament. So for that reason, I think, while superficially attractive, I just can't see any appetite or any urgency, certainly within this current government, to exhaust so much political capital on that sort of constitutional experiment.
And Matt, I put the same question to you. Do you think that is the answer to all of our problems with devolution, their federal system?
Henry Hill, who is deputy editor at Conservative Home, which if you don't already read, you should definitely read. And Henry, you should definitely read because he talks about devolution and federalism on a regular basis. And he calls it the folly of federalism. Unfortunately, Adam Smith actually wrote about a proposition for federalism back in when he wrote The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but which is great because obviously I work at the ASI, so I'm allowed to quote Adam Smith. But he's describing how they thought how American revolutionaries should be kept within the United Kingdom's auspices, and he describes federalism as an option. And he says that the assemblies of the United States, so the colonies, and they actually they said they feel or imagine that if their assemblies, which they're fond of calling parliaments, which may ring somewhat true in Wales, and of considering as equal in authority to the Parliament of Great Britain, should be so far degraded as to become the humble ministers and executors of that Parliament, the greater part in their own importance would be at an end. And they have rejected, therefore, the proposal of being taxed by parliamentary requisition, like other ambitious and high-spirited men have rather chosen to draw the sword in defence of their own importance. That's what Nicola Sturgeon is doing. That is what effectively Mark Drakeford is pushing himself towards, and it's what, of course, Home Rule in Ireland ended up doing as well. Because you set up alternative parliaments, you set up quasi-independent states within the auspices of a federal union, especially one such as our own, and you end up undermining the union in and of itself in the first place. And it was one of the reasons why in 2016, I voted to leave the European Union, because on the day of the vote, I realized powers had gone up and powers had gone down. And in many respects, what it meant to be British, what this Parliament around the corner from me in Westminster does and did on the daily, was being diminished and sapped and wiped out, despite the fact that that was the point at which people cared most about, despite the fact that that was the bit that they switched the news on to hear about, the bit that they had arguments in the pubs about, the people and the personalities they truly cared about. They were being sapped and diminished, and they were weak men. We've ended up with a state that is highly centralized, overly centralized, but incredibly, bizarrely underpowered. And instead, we've got a Welsh Parliament that thinks of itself in such high important terms, is held in such low regard and contempt by its countrymen, and yet has it overpowered compared to what it should be. And so, no, I think federalism would overpower a bunch of pompous men who think of themselves far too highly, who think of themselves as controlling, contriving, who wish to destroy our country, and who want to use institutions to do that. And we shouldn't allow them to control our lives and our country for a second longer. We should move back to having powers where people want them to reside. If that's at a local level, then fine. If that's at a Westminster, at a British level, then that's fine as well. And if there are some powers that we want to hold at a Welsh level, if there are some things that we want to be able to do as a singular Welsh nation, then great. But let's have a conversation that's grown up about which ones they are, without resorting to bully boy tactics, to name calling, to nationalist baiting. That's what we need to move away from, is the idea that people who question whether powers sit at the right level are somehow traitors to their country. They're not. We're all in this together, very much so.
I think that's a definite no from both you. That's federalism. I think that's the folly of federalism has been put to bed just there, right there. That's one last question to you both, as it's now near an hour, but we've had this come up quite a few times in the chat and quite a few questions about it. And this one's from Morgan Brobe and many other people in the chat. Do you see any potential revival of the WDA, either from under a Welsh government of any colour or even an intervention from the UK government? So we'll start with you, Matt.
So the WDA?
Yeah, do you think there's any potential for that revival in the future from under a Welsh government of any colour or intervention from the UK government? Because it's been brought up quite a few times in the chat and questions.
It's bizarre. I love the fact that the WDA, so when Rhodri Morgan obviously came to power and he decided to set a bonfire of the Quangos, and he decided that the one bonfire of the Quangos he was going to get rid of was the only one that made any money. It was just so typical of that period of government, but it was like, but obviously inevitable. In terms of like the Welsh development, like once you've destroyed an institution, you can put it back together again, but it's not the same thing. Right? The people are gone. What makes a company is its people, not whether it's got a shiny logo or a building or the same mission statement. And a lot of what was lost when the WDA went were its people and its expertise, and they're not easily replicatable. However, the Welsh government has created, the Welsh Development Bank, which does exist, and it does a relatively good job actually as a form of sort of credit guarantee. And lender of last resort, and it does have different remits to some of the commercial banks. I would obviously, as a purist, say that there are some that if you can't get lending on a commercial basis, then maybe you shouldn't be able to get credit lending that's taxpayer funded. But if it exists, it exists, and it's there, and therefore again, if it's there, use it, because you may as well, right? if they're going to put it out there, then as a company or a person that's able to access those funds, you'd be insane not to go and access them. So go and do it. Do I think as it already exists, I don't know how many more powers it's going to get. The Welsh government has some borrowing ability. It's never used it. Like the Scottish government has never used its borrowing abilities or its bond raising abilities, despite the fact that they've been there for about 4 or 5 years now. They're far more willing to rely on consequentials and borrowing done on the UK level because they know it's actually stronger. But I don't think it's going to change massively. What I do think, obviously, is that the UK Internal Market Bill does allow for some quite considerable difference in terms of policy and in fact attitude to how investment is made and the investment spends by the UK government are made. Instead of being a place that is forgotten, Wales and Scotland are now very much actively in the eye of special advisors like Tomos was, but at all levels. I mean, I've spoken to quite a few actually in the past few days. They're very actively looking at projects in Wales and in Scotland and across border regions especially. So I would say that is the big change. It's the fact that now the UK is no longer thinking, oh, well, Europe will do it. It is now going, how can we use this to strengthen the case for the UK as a whole in the first place?
Brilliant, thank you. And same to you, Thomas. Do you think you see a potential revival for that, or do you think, like you say, it should be gone through the newer routes that have emerged since the abolition of the WDA?
Well, I think the biggest frustration, and I think Matt's alluded to this with Roger Morgan's decision to get rid of the WDA, was that we lost all that private sector talent and replaced that swashbuckling, buccaneering, private sector zeal, which successive WDA leaders brought to bear in flying the flag for Wales, and replaced it with a risk-averse civil service. And it's no great surprise, I'm afraid, that in its pomp, the WDA attracted the lion's share of all inward investment to the UK, and sadly, we've never been able to match or to rival those sorts of inward investment figures ever since then. Might we replicate it? Might we revive it? I certainly hope so. I mean, as Matt said, it's very difficult to replicate the success of such an iconic organisation or entity as the WDA. But in terms of outlook, in terms of approach, in terms of harnessing the power of the private sector in particular, and bringing that expertise to bear and leveraging the collective contact books and muscle of the captains of industry that we have in Wales, I think there needs to be far more engagement with the private sector, whether that's badged as some sort of WDA-esque body or something else. But I certainly think there has been far too little engagement with the private sector in Wales over the last 20 years, and that has to change. As I said, if we're to grow the economy from the wreckage unleashed by this wretched pandemic, it will be a private sector-led recovery, and we need to be engaging the private sector and making it just that little bit easier and more attractive to start a business, to hire a new member of staff, to retrain a member of staff who may have been on furlough, and to make Wales a desirable place for these international businesses to locate, to invest, and to grow.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree. Like you say, if there's one way out, one way to actually rebuild this economy, the Welsh economy after the pandemic, it is going to be through private investment, which we see all too little of, or much too little of, which if people, just a slight plug, you'll be able to read about in some upcoming CWS reports. But yes, thank you both for joining tonight, and thank you for everyone for turning up. This will go on YouTube if you want to watch it again. I'm very sorry that Suzy Davies had internet issues, which highlights the broadband issue in Wales once again. So
absolutely.
I thank everyone for turning up, and I thank you to Matt and Thomas especially for having good internet and for actually turning up. So thank you both, and hopefully we'll have you on both again soon.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for the questions as well. It was a lively discussion as ever with the centre.
Thank you.
Likewise, and good luck, Thomas, for the election ahead. Yeah. Cheers. I wish you well against some of your competitors.
Cheers. Thank you very much, guys.
Take care all. Good evening.